You know those lists of the greatest opening lines of all time? They're pretty popular. In fact, I have a diagrammatical dissertation on opening lines of notable novels hanging in the background of this video. You can learn a lot from lists of individual great sentences like that. However, those lists are almost always works of fiction, and the vast majority of students spend the vast majority of their time writing nonfiction. As a teacher, I can tell within the first few sentences, almost without fail, if this paper is going to be an enjoyable or tedious read. That's the power of a great hook. If you're still watching this video, thank you by the way, it's because my hook is working. If you're considering clicking away, it's because it's not. And for those of you who don't know, that is pretty much the most important metric to YouTube, if people keep watching past the opening. So if you're still here, thank you again. Get some notes to work with, because in a few minutes, I'm going to show you some of the greatest opening lines in all of nonfiction, what you can learn from them to make yourself a better writer, and 3 of the most cliched, tedious hooks that almost without fail are going to send your teacher packing to slumberland. But also how you could maybe rework those pretty easily to make them exceptionally attention-grabbing hooks. Let's dive into the first example. A great hook really only has to do 2 things. 1, grab the reader's attention, and 2, introduce the topic. Another way of thinking of this is that a hook has to be both interesting and relevant. I have a lot of students who come up with interesting hooks, but they aren't really relevant. Jane Stanford was poisoned in 1905 while in Hawaii, and her murderer was never caught, is a really interesting hook, but not if the paper is on the Stanford prison experiments of the 1970s. So let's take a look at some hooks that do both these things. My first victim was a woman, white, well-dressed, probably in her early 20s. Obviously, this is an attention-grabbing sentence, but is it relevant? Well, absolutely. Brent Staples, in his famous essay, Just Walk On By, is talking about how, as a black man, he alters public spaces. The victim in question here is not a victim of violence, but rather a victim of being scared. And if you read this wonderfully written essay, you'll see how Brent Staples is actually the victim of this perceived violence. It's a phenomenal essay, and students are always keen to read it because this first sentence really grabs your attention. But that through line of victimhood and who is the actual victim in this situation runs through the whole thing, so it's remarkably relevant to the essay in question. So that hook uses some shock factor. You can also be kind of controversial or perhaps even insulting to grab someone's attention. Men are still basically scum when it comes to helping out in the kitchen. This essay, Lost in the Kitchen, is all about men needing to be better, especially when it comes to helping out in the kitchen. And this sort of hook runs the risk of alienating and insulting the very people that the author is trying to get to. If people are too insulted, they dig in their heels and they don't want to change. They're not open to hearing your argument. But the fact that this is an essay by Dave Barry, who's a famous humorist writer, he has a sign hanging up in most Jimmy John's locations, and he's also known for his sports writing, and he is talking about himself in this essay as a fellow man who struggles to help out as much as he should in the kitchen. All of those things kind of disarm it and allow him to come in with this rather heated first sentence, because if the reader reads 2 or 3 more sentences, they'll see that this is not an attack on them. This is an examination of men in general from a man's perspective. Name dropping can also be a powerful tool, like in I'm not on Twitter, but quite often I find myself thinking of Justin Bieber. This essay, Meet Justin Bieber, is not actually about Justin Bieber, although he's definitely a part of it. But if Zadie Smith had a first sentence that was about celebrity culture, it probably wouldn't be as interesting, especially when this essay first came out. All of those have been pretty short hooks, and oftentimes students think they only get 1 sentence to grab the reader's attention. That might be true for a 5-paragraph essay, but if you're writing a longer work, or even if you're not, if you're doing it the right way, you can get away with a longer hook, maybe a couple of sentences, or a really long sentence, such as Robert Sullivan's For the graveyard interested, the recently concluded LIV golf tournament played at former President Donald Trump's Bedminster Country Club, is notable for two juxtapositions: the gravesite of Ivana Trump alongside the first hole, and about 1,300 yards away, the graves of Black Civil War soldiers. This crazy, bizarre juxtaposition of these two things allow Sullivan to grab the person's attention and also shows us exactly where this essay is going. It's going to be talking about politics, but not just today's politics, but the politics that have shaped this country and the policies that have shaped this country for hundreds of years. So those are some examples of some great hooks, and there's so many other ways you can open an essay. And really, if you're struggling to come up with a great hook, you might just need to write the essay. I think a lot of students write the hook first before they really know what they're writing about, and then don't go back and change it. When, in fact, by the time you're done with your first draft, you're probably in a much better position to know what sentence or sentences are going to work best to start off that essay. However, while you can really do pretty much anything you want for a hook, here are some openings that don't inspire confidence from your instructor. The dictionary defines. Okay, let's be real. We've all probably used this or read an essay that used it. It's almost never interesting. If you're writing an essay on empathy, please don't start your essay with the dictionary defines empathy as blah, blah, blah. That definition might be relevant, it might be interesting for the essay, but it's not the most interesting way to start that piece off. However, you can use dictionary definitions to start off a great essay. You just have to be creative about it and make sure that the definition itself is interesting. Take, for instance, the opening two paragraphs of Lars Engner's On Dumpster Diving. Long before I began dumpster diving, I was impressed with dumpsters, enough so that I wrote the Merriam-Webster Research Service to discover what I could about the word dumpster. I learned from them that dumpster is a proprietary word belonging to the Dempsey Dumpster Company. Since then, I have dutifully capitalized the word, although it was lowercased in almost all of the citations Merriam-Webster photocopied for me. Dempsey's word is too apt. I've never heard these things called anything but dumpsters. I do not know anyone who knows the generic name for these objects. These opening two paragraphs, along with a title about diving into dumpsters, immediately grabs the reader's attention. And while it's a little antiquated because we don't have to write to the dictionary and get photocopies sent to us anymore, it's still relevant to anyone who's looked up a seemingly normal word and discovered some interesting little fact about it, such as dumpster being a proprietary word. So if you have an interesting fact, use that in your hook. But if it's just the standard, whatever Google spits out as the go-to definition, and it's a word that a lot of people already know the definition of already, it's not an interesting opening to that essay. Another opening that you need to really be cautious of is blank was born in. I have read so many essays that are about William Shakespeare's Macbeth, and so many students open them with, William Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, the fact of the matter is, William Shakespeare's birth is probably not that relevant to your paper, unless his birth is a really, really crucial part of it. Just the fact that he was born isn't relevant at all. And it's certainly not interesting because everyone who is alive was born. So if you were trying to look up something about LeBron James's run into the playoffs, an essay that you find in Sports Illustrated probably isn't going to start with LeBron James was born in 19 something something in Akron, Ohio, right? Because that's not relevant. So unless your paper really needs to talk about the person's birth, it's not relevant and it's certainly not interesting. However, just like with the dictionary, you can find interesting ways to open an essay with this sort of hook. Take, for instance, the article, What Shakespeare Actually Wrote About the Plague by Stephen Greenblatt. Shakespeare lived his entire life in the shadow of bubonic plague. Right there is a killer hook. Pun intended. On April 26th, 1564, in the parish registry of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, the vicar, John Breckengirdle, recorded the baptism of one Julius Filius Johannes Shakespeare. A few months later, in the same register, the victor noted the death of Oliver Gunn, an apprentice weaver, and in the margins next to that entry scribbled the words, Hic incepit pestis. Here begins the plague. On that occasion, the epidemic took the lives of around a fifth of the town's population. By good fortune, it spared the life of infant William Shakespeare and his family. So, a really interesting historical storytelling approach here. But you'll notice that after that first really good sentence, we get the William Shakespeare was born, birthday, and place. But it doesn't just stop there. It tells us why this is important, because this is a town that is about to be beset by plague. That's why his birth is important, and especially important in an article about what Shakespeare wrote about the plague. The final hook that is cliched and overused is starting a paper off with a seemingly random quote. So often I see students put a quote in there, and the quote might be interesting, but they don't explain why the quote is relevant to the topic. And really, if I can't tell how that quote is relevant basically from the title onward, then you better explain it in the next sentence, or it's not the way to start your essay. You can even look at full books as examples. Right now I'm reading Robert McFarlane's Is a River Alive? And there's an opening sentence from Natalie Diaz that says, "How can I translate, not in words but in belief, that a river is a body, as alive as you or I, that there can be no life without it?" So just from the title of the book, I already know why that quote is being used. Not fully, right? There's nothing wrong with keeping your reader in the dark a little bit. David Foster Wallace starts out, "This is water," with a little story about two fish. And you don't really understand why those two fish are important till you get to the end of the essay, but the title lets us know that it is connected. Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie, another great example about reading a Superman comic book, becomes really important at the end. You fully realize it, but just from the title, you can tell how that first sentence is already relevant. So if you're going to lead off with a quote or a story or anything like that, make sure it's relevant, and you either make that clear from how it works with the title, or you explain it right away, or you opt for a different way to open up your essay. I hope this video was helpful for you, and it showed you how a hook should be something that you are excited about writing. It's one of those places where even in a rather academic, dry essay, you get to be really creative. You kind of get to play Hollywood screenwriter making their elevator speech, or marketer pitching their next great idea for a product name. Right? You get this chance to really try and grab the reader's attention. And as someone who reads a lot of student writing, I can guarantee you that your instructor will appreciate the time you put into that quote. Even if on the rubric it is not the most weighted thing, it's not worth like 80% of the paper or something like that, but because it's that first sentence, it's that first note in the symphony or the song that you want people to continue to listen to, it's really important. So I hope you're able to come up with a great hook, and if you can't, remember, put it off for a little bit, write more of your paper, put on that Blues Traveler song and take a nice walk, and then let it bring you back, and you'll have something. Have fun with it. Happy writing. See you in the next video.